feel really conflicted about this one because I've heard sort of I haven't seen the actual experiment, which is fascinating in terms of like how big that difference is. But you see this argument a lot, and you see it, for example, something like the React framework, where people go, "This is just so huge, it makes it big, it makes it harder. What problem were we even trying to solve?" And let's
Yeah,
go back to HTML. And I think perhaps because I'm a natural optimist, I find it really uncomfortable, this idea that we're not making things better, even though there is evidence that we're not. And I think you're right that sometimes what we're getting is something that's more subtle. So we're getting, better security, or we're getting better browser, compatibility, or something like that. But yeah, it does seem that we try and make things better and we make it worse, which is just
yeah.
sad.
It seems to me it's the kind of complex adaptive system thing. You prod it in one place and it pops out in another, and all of those sorts of things. And that the pressures on a successful open source producer are kind of different. You want to keep releasing new stuff, and so you end up growing something like Spring, which I thought started out as a nice simple thing, and now is so massive and overcomplicated. I don't want to use it, to be honest. Uh, and and that seems like a common sort of trend very often. And I'm old, and so I have a limited memory these days. So I want stuff that's easy to think about. I want the surface area of the tools that I use to be simple enough to help me, and no more complicated than that idea. Ideally clever, but not but easy to use.
Yeah, and simplicity is absolutely the hardest thing to achieve. And it's hard to achieve, and it's even harder to maintain, because you're right that
Yeah,
there's always new feature requirements. There's just always this sort of, gravitational accumulation of cruft, both in a code base, but then also in the user interface.
yeah,
And I think what makes it hard to talk about simplicity is that there's sort of two kinds of simplicity, isn't there? So there's this sort of, I think, going back to that argument of I tried to do it the old way and it was much simpler, but was I actually doing a like for like equivalent?
yeah,
Sometimes you can do something where you say, okay, I've just re-implemented this, using basic HTML, using C, whatever, look how small it is. And you haven't implemented the same thing. You've just implemented the really naive equivalent that looks superficially the same, but isn't.
yeah.
And that's sort of one argument about, oh, we need to be simpler. But then on the other hand, you do get the cases where the system is so elegant, and you do have something that did achieve everything that it needed to, and it did it while getting rid of a whole bunch of external complexity and a whole bunch of pitfalls for the user and that kind of thing. And I think that those systems are really, really fantastic.
So I don't know whether this is an unfair question, but what sorts of techniques would you use to try and achieve that kind of elegant simplicity rather than stupid simplicity?
I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, partly just because it's an interesting question. Um, but so one thing I've been thinking about is, sort of in the context of my day job, which is Quarkus, and we certainly believe that we've achieved something which, is giving you that kind of double win where it's elegant and then it is easier to use and faster and better and all of that. But I think one of the ways that we did that is, which I think is totally generalizable, is to look for the assumptions that are no longer true. And then if you can carve out everything that's related to supporting this assumption that's no longer true, then things get a lot easier. So with Quarkus, for example, and this is just one example of an assumption, Java used to be really heavily optimized for dynamism. So I used to work on OSGI, and with OSGI, the whole point, the problem being solved was, can I change the engine while the plane is flying?
Hmm.
And now we're running in containers. You should not be SSHing into your container to, try and dynamically patch your Java runtime to like introduce new classes. That
Yeah.
is, you should be using CI because CI is a thing, and, just rebuilding the whole thing. So all of this dynamism, there was, in terms of the the sort of the runtime complexity, there was a tax being paid for it. But then
Yeah.
also in terms of just the sort of the architecture of the system and then the implications for how you programmed it, there was all this stuff related to dynamism that you just, in 98% of the cases, don't need. So if we get rid of that, then, things become easier. And I think there's probably equivalent, answers from like other things where we can just say, well, wait a minute, why are we even doing this anymore? Let's get rid of this. And then it just takes this sort of cascade of other crap that we didn't want along with it.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's an interesting idea. I've thought about something, a similar idea, I think, but from a slightly different angle. I was kind of quite influenced from a process point of view by lean ideas and the idea of
Mm,
trying to, get more out for less work. And so it's trying to take work out of the process and driving it that way. And that feels to me like a very similar idea to what you're describing, is trying to find those ways in which, we can remove stuff that we don't, we remove those assumptions that we don't care about anymore. And it's again that part, you can't really predict those things. As you say, the dynamism thing sounded like a decent, a good idea at the time, and
mm.
it's just turned out that it wasn't good enough to it wasn't as important as other things.
Yeah. Or it was necessary at the time, but the world
Yeah,
the
yeah.
world
Or
changed.
the world, yeah, one of those things, absolutely. Um, so we've got to kind of keep that focus. So one of the techniques that I think about, and seems increasingly part of the way that I think about software development, is to be much more strongly outcome focused and sort of designing from the outside in rather than
Yeah.
the inside out, and thinking, what's the minimum that a user of my software needs to do to achieve whatever it is that they want to achieve, and trying to make sure that I'm able to do that. I've always liked software that was doing clever things but was easy to use. There was a years ago there was um, a a a paint program called Corel Draw, which I thought was wonderful because it was elegantly simple, much simpler than others at the time, but you could do quite powerful things. And I've always liked that. Gradle is a good example of that. Gradle, I can have a one-line build script if I want to take all of their suggestions. I just say um, import Java or whatever the equivalent is. I can't remember now, but it's a Java build, and then I could just take the defaults and it'll work. And I like that smartness, but I can override it and I can make it
Mm.
do smarter things, tailor it if I need to.
Yeah, I think that's another sort of, yeah. Oh, I've got two things to say, so I need to remember because one, I think that outside in perspective is so powerful, and I think a really good team will have the combination of some people who are maybe outsiders, so then they can bring that outside in perspective better, and then the people with the deep knowledge. Because I sometimes have with my team, a conversation where I say, well, let's make it work like this because that's the nicest experience, and then my colleagues will say, well, that's nice, except it's impossible. And I'm like, okay, well, let's fix the fact that it's impossible. And then
Yeah,
we can, because that's what it should be. And most
yeah,
things that seem impossible are fixable eventually. But I think that idea of extending and going past the simple is really important too, because we have such a problem in our industry of kind of the demoware, don't we?
yeah,
Or the
yeah,
sort of the golden path, which is surrounded by barbed wire. And so like, as long as you're on the golden path, you're like, oh, this is so great, this is so simple.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
you want to do one tiny little other thing, and then you spend, 3 weeks reading the user manual and like fighting it, and you can't. And so you need to have it so that the 80% of the use cases are really simple, and the other 20% of the use cases, they might not be easy, but at least they're possible.
yeah, yeah. I've always thought of that as the kind of low code problem,
Yeah.
or as it used to be called before low code, the 4GL problem. You kind of you build something that's good at building things in a niche, but half a step outside the niche, and it's either impossible or at least very hard.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a reason why general purpose programming languages are more popular. It's because they're general purpose, and we can solve any problem that you can think of pretty much. This clip was taken from my podcast, The Engineering Room with Dave Farley. a monthly podcast with some of the brightest minds in software engineering. You can find full episodes on all your favourite podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts and Amazon Music. Your support helps us to bring you these regular episodes, so please leave your positive review on your preferred podcast platform to help us to continue to grow and bring you great guests and their insights. Thank you very much for listening.